Welcome to New Libs on the Block. I am Andy Smith.
I'm Brion Curran.
Kristi Pursell.
And we are talking on a sad, crazy, incredibly out of whack day. Kristi, you have some breaking news for us.
So there are two huge things that did not happen today. The first is that Queen Bee herself, Beyonce, did not make her big announcement today. She was going to announce something today. The Beehive is all aflutter. We don't know what it's going to be, but because of the wildfires in LA, and our hearts go out to everyone whose homes have been decimated, and it's really, really scary. So she postponed her big announcement. So that's the first thing that didn't happen today. And then
I'm not a member of the Beehive, but I'm very sorry for you, Kristi. I know you are a dues paying member, so I know this must be hard.
Neither am I, but I'm a friend and happy to listen.
And, I was like looking for a little good news today, but we'll have to wait, because the second thing that didn't happen is that there was no quorum in the Minnesota House of Representatives today. However, that did not stop Republicans from just kind of running roughshod over our Constitution. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yes, and I would hazard to say, more important than Beyonce not coming out with an album. That might get me in some hot water in some places, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I think at the beginning we should just talk about where we are at in the Minnesota House of Representatives. Obviously, last episode, we gave you an overview, how we got to the place where we were thinking about denying quorum as a caucus. And then, obviously, we're a week later, and we have gotten to the point where we did deny quorum. Today, as we are recording, it is Tuesday, January 14th, which is when the first day of session should have been. Actually, we did gavel in and gavel out, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But we wanted to just give you a quick reminder of how we got here. People of Minnesota in November in our elections voted in an incredible way. Only the second time this has ever happened in state history, an exact tie between the two parties, 67 Democrats and 67 Republicans in the Minnesota House. Really weird, very unique, but we had to power share. The whole system that we are under really is designed for one party to hold control and help business move through our House. So to do that with two co-partners is just weird. But we were going forward with that. And actually, negotiations were going really well. We were going to have co-chairs in all our committees. The speakership, it was going to be some sort of co-speakership position. And in the Constitution of Minnesota, it says very clearly that a majority of the Minnesota House is needed to pass any law, which is 68 members. So no matter what, we have to work together if we want to pass budgets, if we want to pass bills, which is incredibly important. Then a lot of court cases started to take place around membership in the Minnesota House, particularly around members of the Democratic caucus. And because of how those things shook out, we'll talk about those more in a minute. Actually, Brion will give a really great overview of one of the cases that actually came down with a decision this morning as we are recording, again, January 14th. Basically, the Republicans got it into their head that even though the people of Minnesota voted a tie, and that is what needs to be recognized in the Minnesota House, they were going to pretend to be the majority. They were going to try to grab power as the majority. And to be clear, when you are a majority in a legislative house, you are in control of all of the bills that pass through that house. Everything that goes through committees, everything that goes through the floor, everything that is passed off the floor and headed over to the Senate for approval. So this really is not just that they would, for a couple weeks until a special election was held, have some temporary power, but that for the next 2 years, every single vote we took as the Minnesota House would be outside of the realm of what the people of Minnesota voted for in November of 2024. And that is up to and including refusing to seat members of our caucus that they deem illegitimate for whatever reason, particularly Representative Brad Tapke, who's representing District 54A in Shakopee. And that is the court case that we got a decision on this morning. It's a great court case. Brion, tell us a little bit about it and that decision.
Thank you, Andy, for that overview. Today, we learned from the judge in the Tapke case that after all evidence was presented, the facts are that Brad Tapke received more votes than his opponent in the general election, and they were able to determine who the voters were. To back up a little bit, in this case, the biggest part of the contest, election contest, was 20 ballots that had gone missing that so far seemed to be an error by someone who worked at the city. No ill intent or ill will, but that aside, 20 ballots did go missing. Now, they were able to narrow down who those voters were and bring voters in as witnesses to testify who they voted for. Brad Tabke won the general election by 14 votes. There was a recount, and that stayed firm that there was a 14-vote lead in Brad Tabke's favor. And after the testimonies from the voters who were brought in, the judge concluded, as had we prior, that there was no mathematical possibility that the other candidate won this race. Brad Tabke won a race. It was very, very close. A lawsuit was filed, and the judge found absolutely no grounds, no basis to proceed with a special election in that district. In fact, a special election would disenfranchise everyone who did show up to exert their power as voters in that district. Close races happen. We have confirmed members before with similar leads in their vote count, 15, I know. This is totally unprecedented, not following the outcome of a court case. And I think, for Republicans to say that they weren't going to follow whatever the court said, that was a red flag right there. There's still an opportunity to come to the table and say, look, we recognize that Republicans have 67 members. Democrats have 66 because there's currently an open seat in District 40B in Roseville. Let's have Republicans have a speakership and control of the House until that member then is sworn in. When we get back to 67-67, we would implement that equal power sharing agreement similar to what the Senate has just adopted. Now, Melissa Hortman, who's the speaker designate for the DFL caucus in the House, has made attempts to offer Republicans more and more and more that go beyond the 2-week Republican power, the 2-week Republican control of power in the House. There were offers made that were even greater than that, and they were declined by Lisa Dameth, the speaker designate of the Republican caucus. I will also add that after the case was released today, Republicans still could not confirm if they would allow Brad Tabke to take his seat as a duly elected member of the House of Representatives. And Lisa Dameth has not confirmed that they won't attempt to unseat this duly elected member on any given day should we provide quorum and show up at the Capitol.
And not even just Representative Brad Tabke, but why would they stop there?
Others. Yep.
Other members who they don't like, who are Democrats who have election certificates and who won our elections, they have not said that they'll honor the will of the people. The 45-page ruling this morning from the judge in Scott County, this judge went above and beyond to be like, don't F with this election, people. It said Brad Tabke remains the candidate with the most votes legally cast in the 2024 general election for Minnesota House District 54A. This election is not invalid. Neither an injunction nor a special election is warranted or ordered. And that's the thing that the House GOP, what they were saying in their press conferences and their media appearances, were saying, well, we're going to abide by the court's ruling in the 40B election, which said that one of our members failed the residency test, but because we like that one because that benefits us. But what we don't like is the one that says that a Democrat won, and we want a special election there. So, of course, the hypocrisy and the inconsistency remains. And so it was a really, really big day. Not only did quorum fail to happen, but we finally got the ruling out of Shakopee that we had been waiting for a month, maybe. I mean, it's hard with the holidays in there.
Yeah.
But it was pretty unequivocal, saying there's no grounds or basis to say that this election was rigged or stolen. Tabke won, full stop.
And that leads us to noon today. We knew that power sharing disagreement went up till, as Brion said, midnight last night and even into this morning. But the Republicans, even though we offered them until the people of Roseville were able to have their say in a special election, to act as majority, which is what they're saying they want. when really what they want is complete power over this institution. We did what we said we were going to do. We denied quorum. And that led to this picture. Which is the Democratic caucus denying quorum at noon. What happened, as the Constitution says, is our presiding officer for that day was Secretary of State Steve Simon. He got up there, gavelled in, and after a roll call that made it clear that only 67 members were present, he said a quorum cannot be established.
They swore in all the Republican members.
They swore in the Republican members. So some stuff happened, but the basis substantially what happened is he said there is not a number necessary for a quorum. The House of Representatives is adjourned, and then banged his gavel. And that is legitimately all that happened in the Minnesota House of Representatives today, full stop. Now, after about 5 or 10 minutes, and there was some shuffling around in the chamber, another person stood up and went to the rostrum after Steve Simon had left. This was a Republican member, and they started proceedings in a Kangaroo Court of Representatives, completely unconstitutionally, completely undemocratically, completely outside of the realm of the power that they have and have been granted by the people of Minnesota. And they fake elected a speaker, Lisa Dameth. She made up a rules committee made up only of members of the Republican Party to make up rules for what this made-up house can do or can't do. And I thought this was weird. I don't know why they did it. They moved around our seating arrangements on the floor so that Republicans literally get the front section and Democrats are in the back. I think a pretty heavy metaphor of what they want to do to the voices of the voters of Minnesota. Kristi, you want to say something?
Well, what's interesting, so typically in our chamber, it's the left and the right side of the chamber. So I don't know if this means like the staff is actually going to move name tags around, because this was all after adjournment. So, I mean, this whole thing puts the staff, the nonpartisan staff, in a really hard position. But in the other body, Minnesota Senate, the minority sits in the front and the majority sits in the back. So I also thought that was really interesting. Like, oh, so y'all are going to arrange yourselves the way that the Senate does when you're not in power? Okay, cool. It was sort of a head scratch move for sure.
And that brings us up to now. Basically, as we're recording this, is a developing situation. We are sad. I think it's safe to say, I know at least 2/3 of us have cried. Brion, I haven't gotten confirmation if there are tears on your side yet, probably. Because it's sad. This is not something that should happen. This is expressly against the will of the people of Minnesota. This is a breakdown, a constitutional crisis that no one wants to have, that the Republicans are forcing because of their malfeasance and irresponsible behavior.
If I could jump in here, I'm really disappointed. And I'm disappointed that the sort of game playing on behalf of Republicans to try to gain some sort of majority that was never going to exist given the election results provided by Minnesotans across the state. I'm disappointed that collectively as a caucus, they could not come together to recognize facts, to recognize reality, to respect the Minnesota State Constitution and what it says. And I find it really harmful and, again, disappointing for the state of Minnesota, because we were all sent there to represent. And I know I'm not alone in getting messages about not showing up for work. But, you know, a denial of quorum is an act that we take, and we don't take it lightly. That is a function of our position in government to make the best possible decision on behalf of our districts in the state of Minnesota. And in this case, a denial of quorum on the first day of session guaranteed that Republicans would not kick out a duly elected member of office, as they have stated they will do. Now, we could also go down the road of, you know, why do Republicans want to do this? Well, like we said, this race was determined by 14 votes, as confirmed by a judge in that election contest case this morning. So Republicans see the opportunity to flip this seat. And I find it really interesting that we'll hear Republican talking points about following the laws under their interpretation when it suits them, and following the law in a different interpretation and when it suits them. So talk about following laws, following Constitution. Like Kristi had mentioned, they're fine with the results of, a vacancy in 40B and relying on voters to go through that process and deliver a different representative. But at the same time, saying voters in Shakopee that showed up don't matter. The ultimate authority of election certificates in the House of Representatives are the legislators themselves. And they have stated time and time again, even today in negotiations, that it is their right and their power. And I think at this point, they think it's their duty to usurp the collective opinions of voters across Minnesota and decide for themselves who they want to represent 54A. And I just cannot be more disappointed that that is the reality we were looking at. And we could not provide quorum when that was the situation we were looking at.
Yeah, I want to jump in on that because I just came from a press conference. That's why I have a tie on. I love you all, but I did not put on a tie for you guys. And the reporter asked me, what are you going to say, or what do you want to say to your constituents about why you're not representing them in St. Paul right now? And I said, that is not the question. I am representing the people of my district by not showing up to that illegitimate grab for power. I am representing the people of 25B, the majority of which voted for me to represent them as much when I vote no on a bill or on an amendment as when I vote yes on a bill and on an amendment. When I keep things from happening that I think will hurt my constituents, and when I actively take place in making things happen to help my constituents. That's all part of the job. And right now, my job is to protect the will of the people of Minnesota and the people of my district for the next 2 years, as long as I'm in this elected position. And so that's what I'm doing. It's not that we aren't showing up for the work. This is the work right now. Representing the people of our state and making sure that their voice, as expressed in a free and fair election, is protected no matter what. And that includes, by the way, again, to go back to what Brion mentioned with our power sharing agreements, we're not advocating for DFL majority rule. In fact, we said, sure, for these 3 weeks, we're down one, you act as a majority until we know what the voters of Roseville want from this situation. And they said no, very clearly. Don't let the people decide. We decide. And that is tyrannical. That is anti-democratic. That's anti-Republican, by the way. I don't mean the party. I mean the principle of republicanism. And that it's an affront on this. Our Constitution is the very basis of all of our law that they are running roughshod, including the constitutional office. Secretary of State Steve Simon, who is, in the state of Minnesota, if you don't know listening to this, is himself elected to his position. He's not appointed by the governor. He is directly voted on by every single voter in Minnesota. And that's who they ran roughshod over today.
And I think then the question sort of becomes, what's next? And by the time this comes out, 15 things could have changed and happened, because it takes a minute to do the editing and uploading and all that. So I'm learning how to do it, y'all. So it's taking me a minute, but we're going to try to turn this around and get this out as fast as possible. But likely, we don't know for sure, but likely there will be an immediate Supreme Court challenge, because most scholars' interpretations of our Constitution says 67 is not a majority. So therefore, everything after Steve Simon hit that gavel is pretend and is not. No legal proceedings happened after that time.
Principle of judicial review, the judicial branch has the power to review what is happening in the legislative space and say if it's constitutional or not. That's the grounds that probably is going to come about to say this is illegitimate.
We imagine. And last time we talked about this is one of our colleagues said, this is the Minnesota Nice version of January 6th. Like, this is not people with guns. This is not people breaking into the Capitol. This is not people dying like we saw when right-wing MAGA extremists broke into the U.S. Capitol.
And thank God for that. We were nervous about what would happen. So thank God that didn't happen.
About our staff's safety, about the Secretary of State. We were nervous. We just didn't know what was going to happen. And so very grateful that this was a peaceful coup, but it lends more of an air of legitimacy because it wasn't a dude with a Viking helmet and furs on, like, taking a dump on Nancy Pelosi's desk. it has the air of legitimacy and it sort of looks like a more normal proceeding, but that's why it's so, so important for us to call out. This was illegitimate. This was illegal. This is unconstitutional, and this is wrong. This is a dark, dark, dark day for democracy, especially in the state of Minnesota.
And I will add too, I'd go so far as to call this insurrection without violence. This was a government takeover that we saw play out in front of viewers across the state of Minnesota today. The law is clear. The Constitution is clear. Session was adjourned without an adequate quorum. And one party attempted to, again, usurp the will of Minnesota voters. I can't stress enough that even though this was seemingly peaceful, this was still an overtaking of power that was completely unlawful and illegitimate. And, the primary reason for me and for my district that I made the choice not to provide quorum and become part of a system that believes legislators are more important than constituents and can just decide whatever they want. My presence at the Capitol would have given people with different opinions power to just be the judge and jury of every single member of the House that they deemed, for whatever reason, they wanted to not be there. And so I feel, I'm getting messages from constituents, like I said, and I know everybody else is too. It's so, so important that we clearly call this out for what it is. And like Andy said, by not showing up, we are doing our jobs. We are protecting some terrible and further illegal actions from taking place at the Capitol, including making an election decision on their own as representatives without voter consent.
Absolutely. And just to double down on that, we will still be working all throughout however long this denial of quorum goes on, which seems it's going to be a couple weeks, but we don't know at this particular moment. So just as an example, I mentioned I'm coming from a press conference. We did that press conference at our Olmsted Recycling Center because that's one of our bonding issues. And we did a tour afterwards with the manager and with one of our directors at Olmsted County for our environmental resources. Because that's a huge bonding priority. And that's what we would normally be doing, making sure that we have that bill in line, that I'm educated on that bill, that our fellow representatives are educated on that bill so we can advocate for it when we're able to advocate in a legitimate House of Representatives. We'll be doing that every single day. I'm sure I can speak for both of you all. Be answering emails. We will be writing legislation, I'm sure, talking to experts about legislation. There's a lot we can do to make sure that by the end of this legislative session, we're still passing budgets. So we are still working for the people of Minnesota while we are in this unfortunate space that we're doing to defend Minnesotans.
One final thought I'd love to leave our podcast with today is, as our speaker designate, Melissa Hortman, has stated, there were 20 days available for all of us to work at the House of Representatives under a Republican majority, under a temporary majority, 67-66. Now that opportunity to work together is 19 days. Time is being wasted day by day for us to get to work under a Republican majority until we are back to full membership at 134. So really important there to recognize that this is time that we could be having committees and passing bills together as a full body. And unfortunately, that's not happening because Republicans insist on overturning the will of voters.
And I think with that, again, this is a developing situation. So I think for today, we'll be done sort of describing the situation as we see it, but this will develop very fast. So we may have special episodes. Keep an eye on your podcast feeds, but also we want to hear from you because we know we are in it. We are surrounded by it. And we know this system better than you, our listeners, because we're inside of it. And we know that there might be some questions you have. So please reach out to New Libs Podcast. Our handle is at New Libs Podcast on Blue Sky and Instagram. I don't know why that was so hard for me to say. You can also email newlibspodcast@gmail.com with questions if you have certain thoughts, and we will share them on the show next time we record and hopefully answer them for you. And with that, on sort of a sad, somber note, you've heard from the New Libs, and now go out on the block.
Hi.